Hello, I am Emmeline Weber from Brookings. I'd like to welcome you all on behalf of the South Dakota Humanities Council, which produces the annual Festival of Books. We would like to acknowledge, first and foremost, that we stand on ground of the Oceti Sakowin, the Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota people. We honor and appreciate the indigenous people who have the longest relationship to this place. Please help me to thank the SDSU Briggs Library for hosting this event, as well as the dozens of volunteers who plan, promote, and staff festival events. You too can help the festival. First, you can provide us with feedback about this year's event. The link to our online survey is available at sdbookfestival.com. Second, you can help keep the festival free by making a tax-deductible donation to the South Dakota Humanities Council. Please use the QR code found at our donation stations and info tables, or go to sdhumanities.org. Remember, we'd love a $50 for 50 years donation, which enters you into the drawing for the Festival Guide cover painting by Jennifer White. This festival would not be possible without the generous support of the numerous organizations and individuals who have already donated and are acknowledged on the back of the cover of the Festival Guide. Today's program is called Prairie Politics, a discussion of Great Plains political history. Jon Lauck is a native of rural Madison, South Dakota. He is the author of books including The Lost Region and From Warm Center to Ragged Edge. Lauck has worked as a lawyer, professor, and political advisor, and now serves as an adjunct professor of history and political science at the University of South Dakota, and as editor-in-chief of Middle West Review. His latest books are The Good Country and Heartland River. William C. Pratt is professor of history emeritus at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. His research, focused on the history of political and farm movements on the Northern Plains, has taken him from Montana to Moscow. Pratt has served as Distinguished Fulbright Lecturer in American History at Moscow State University, lecturing on U.S. farm and labor movements, and Senior Fulbright Lecturer in American Studies at the University of Warsaw, teaching about the Great Plains and recent American history. Tony Venhuizen of Sioux Falls holds a bachelor's degree from South Dakota State University and a law degree from the University of South Dakota. He first entered politics in 2010 when he managed Governor Dennis Dugard's gubernatorial campaign. Prior to his current employment in trust and estate law, Venhuizen served as chief of staff in the administrations of Governor Dugard and Governor Kristi Noem, and was an education policy advisor in the governor's office. He was appointed to the South Dakota Board of Regents by Governor Noem in 2021. Please welcome our presenters.
Well, thank you for coming out. Is this on? All right. I thought we'd do it a little more informally and do it from the table here and have more of a discussion. Wanted to recognize some of the SDSU royalty here today. Bob Burns taught political science at South Dakota State for many, many years, including me back in the 1980s. Do you remember those classes, Bob?
Tony stood out a little bit more.
Right.
Burn.
Well, it's a lot more recent.
Also want to recognize Noel Hamill back there, who's a publisher of the Mitchell Daily Republic and the Yankton Press and Dakotan. I think the Yankton Press and Dakotan is the oldest newspaper in South Dakota, as I recall. Started in about 1861. And Seth Tepper here, another longtime South Dakota journalist. He is launching a new endeavor, which we'll hear about in coming weeks, I suppose, to cover South Dakota politics. So we have a great group for this discussion. We're talking about prairie politics in general, but more specifically a couple of books. One is the product of many years of research by my old friend Bill Pratt here from University of Nebraska, Omaha. Bill is from Berks County, Pennsylvania, 15 miles or so from downtown Philadelphia, and had a couple of jobs, but ended up at University of Nebraska, Omaha for many years. And so went out to talk to a lot of farm activists in the Midwest, including during the 1980s, when I know he spent a lot of time in Iowa in particular, talking to the Iowa Farm Unity Coalition and some of those famous groups that were working on the farm crisis. I might add as a parenthetical that Pamela Riney Kerberg, who's a professor at Iowa State, just released her book today on the history of the 80s farm crisis, which is heavily focused on Iowa. University Press of Kansas published that. The book I'm most immediately involved in is Volume 4 of the Plains Political Tradition, and I thought I'd give you a little background on how that project came to be. It started here at SDSU, very close probably to Bob Burns's office over in Scobie Hall. Many of you may have seen the display out here dedicated to John Miller, who unfortunately passed away far too young, longtime historian of South Dakota and Midwestern politics. But he retired in 2001 or 2, somewhere in there, and I was hired to teach his classes for a few years, and so I was teaching here. And a reporter called and asked me, wanted to get some quotes for a story about some political events that were going on in South Dakota, and they said, how would you describe South Dakota exactly? Is it a purple state or a red state or populist state, and what does populism mean? And I gave some quotes that were sufficient, I guess, for the moment, but John Miller and I started talking about how do we describe the politics of this place and the political culture of this place. And so we started making notes, and if you know John Miller, pretty soon there was a blizzard of papers and emails and calls, and it led to an article that we wrote with the longtime South Dakota geographer not Ben Hogan, that's the golfer. Yeah, Ed Hogan, and it was great. It was a nice little synopsis, snapshot, drawing on a lot of history and political maps and a lot of the work that John Miller had done and Bill Pratt had done. And that became an article in the quarterly journal, South Dakota History. Deidre Berzer is head of South Dakota Historical Society Publications, so she oversees the journal. And then we decided that was a great hit, so we spun it off into a book, which became Volume 1 of the Plains Political Tradition series, which is all chapters about South Dakota politics. And we had that launch conference of that book over in Mitchell at Dakota Wesleyan at the McGovern Center when George McGovern was still alive, and he participated in the conference and weighed in on our findings and what he thought about various things. I noticed last night they had the 100th anniversary of George McGovern's birth party at Dakota Wesleyan. So, and George McGovern's opinions are to be taken seriously in this area because he was a historian. Went to Northwestern University, earned his PhD in the 1940s, and was always a major history buff. So loved to be involved in these sorts of projects. But why don't I start off this discussion with, I'll turn it over to Bill here in a second, and then we'll go to Tony, because Tony has chapters in some of these volumes. But I thought we could ask Bill maybe to, before you talk about your book a little bit, give us a sense of what you mean by populism, because the term gets bandied around a lot in modern day political discourse, and not everyone really knows what it means. But you're the expert on populism, so give us your thoughts on that.
Populism was a late 19th century political movement, and that's what we should use the term to describe and forget about it in the 20th century. I think what has happened, the word has come to mean a political style rather than political content, whereas the populists of the late 19th century, and that's where the term originally came from, they had a political platform. They wanted to have direct election of U.S. senators, direct election of President of the United States. They wanted secret elections, secret ballots. They were in favor of federal government farm programs. They had a specific set of proposals, part of a platform. Today, that term populism is used in so many different ways, and that's been going on for decades. Back in the 1960s, George McGovern was a populist, according to the media. So was George Wallace. Now, how you put something together there, I don't know. And it's gotten worse since then. So some of us are still purist about that term and think it should be limited to that 19th century political movement, which was very strong in South Dakota, North Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas. In those states, they elected populists as governors, as U.S. senators, members of Congress. I think in some respects, populism of the 19th century was strongest in the northern plains and the central plains. Now, it had some support in the south, but it really was a regional political movement. But I'm a purist on that term, and it's a losing battle.
Tony, do you want to talk a little bit about your contribution to the Plains political tradition?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So there have been 4 volumes of this book. The second one that came out in 2014, I think, John asked me to write a chapter that was just generally about the history of South Dakota's governors, which is something that I've spent a lot of time researching over the last 10 or 12 years, and collecting biographical information and just trying to bring a lot of this together, because a lot of it is very poorly sourced and not something that's been written about a lot. So I wrote a chapter for that book that just kind of went through the people who'd held that office and the trends over time and how it's changed and how it really hasn't changed. You find, and he was just talking about populism, what you find when you study that is that at times when the ag economy was poor in South Dakota, you see kind of populist outbursts, whether that's the Populist Party or when the Democrats managed to win the governor's office. We had the progressive movement in the 1910s and 20s, but really after a lot of that kind of crashed and burned, since that time you've seen a very strong strain of cautious fiscal conservatism, often in both parties. And that kind of bled over into the article I wrote for this book, Volume 4. And I'll tell the backstory of that a little bit, which is about William J. Bulow, who was the first Democrat to be governor of South Dakota in the late 1920s. And I've been for a long time now on the board of directors of the Trail of Governors in Pierre, which commissions all the bronze statues of former governors around Pierre. We just finished it this year, so every former governor now has a statue in Pierre. But as part of that, we would try to identify the families or descendants of these governors, particularly the ones long in the past, just so that they'd be aware we were doing this and can have some input into the design. And sometimes they want to contribute to the statue, sometimes not. In quite a few cases, there is no family left in South Dakota. Their descendants are all gone. And that happened with Bulow. He was governor for 4 years and then a U.S. senator for 12 years, and then he stayed in Washington, D.C. after he lost re-election. And so his family stayed out on the East Coast, and that's where his descendants still are. So I got to talking to his granddaughter, who was in her 80s and lived in New Jersey, I think. And she was talking to me about her grandfather and this and that, and mentioned that he had written a memoirs, an autobiography. And by this point, I'd been researching these guys for a long time, and I'd never seen such a thing. And I told her that. I said, I've never seen Bulow's autobiography. She said, well, that's because he never published it. She said, in fact, I think I may have the only copy. So, well, I'd love to see that. When he left the U.S. Senate, he bought a typewriter, and he sat down and just kind of hacked out his memoirs over 2 or 3 years in the 1940s. So she mailed me the only copy. So I got it at the state capitol. I took it over to the state library. I got him to scan it all in for me, and I mailed it right back to her because I didn't want to be responsible for this. But we had the scan of it. It's probably 150,000 words. He goes off on some very long tangents about, farm ground he bought and sold or different. I mean, there's a lot of, it's just like anything. It's also, he's a guy who grew up speaking German, and his schooling was very intermittent. And so if you read it out loud, it makes perfect sense. He's a very funny guy. He's a good storyteller. His spelling is terrible. His punctuation doesn't make any sense. He never uses a paragraph. And so I did the work really mostly during the COVID period of going through and rewriting the entire thing correcting all the spelling and punctuation and so that it's readable. Didn't really, sometimes just lightly rephrasing something. But after I did that, the press asked me if they could excerpt that. So there was, this was last spring that they excerpted about 20,000 words out of that in the journal. And for that, I picked out more stuff about when he was governor. He was governor when they started Mount Rushmore. He was governor when Coolidge came to the hills. He has a lot of good stories about that. That's what I excerpted there. When this story for the Plains political tradition looked more at when he was a senator, and it kind of goes to what I was saying about our governors more generally. He got elected to the U.S. Senate in 1930, so the Great Depression had just started. He beat William McMaster, who had been a progressive Republican governor. Gets to the U.S. Senate as a Democrat, but he's a fiscal conservative. He'd actually vetoed the state budget one year because it spent too much. He really liked Franklin Roosevelt because Roosevelt, when he was running for president, promised to cut spending and balance the budget in a speech in Pittsburgh. So he was all for that. Became very disillusioned with FDR, and if you read his memoirs, it's just endless. He's just so incredibly sarcastic and dismissive of Franklin Roosevelt. He just hates him. Also was an isolationist. And so here you have this guy who is an anti-New Deal, isolationist Democrat trying to exist in the 1930s. Doesn't really, increasingly doesn't fit in. He helped kill the court packing plan in 1938. In 1936, he supported Alf Landon for president, the Republican against Roosevelt. Ironically, our other senator, Peter Norbeck, who was a progressive Republican, also crossed party lines and supported Roosevelt. So we had both of our senators crossing the line there, the opposite direction. By 1942, he never lost the general election in South Dakota. He was very popular, but he got beat in the Democratic primary by Tom Berry, because by 1942, his position as a Democrat was just totally untenable. He was against World War II. He voted for World War II after Pearl Harbor, but still thought it was all Roosevelt's fault. He typified, though, and this is the point I make in the article, after the progressive era ended and a lot of these programs went broke and a lot of these things went bad, and then you have the Depression, we really had a time there when the two parties were competing to see who could be more conservative. And Bulow's loss ended that era, and the Democrats went back to being a more typical, following the path of Roosevelt and Truman, and really led them for South Dakota down the wrong path. I mean, by 1952, the Republicans won every state Senate seat and all but 2 state House seats, and we had a period where the national Democrats had put the state Democrats in a place where they were unelectable. I mean, we're kind of in that same kind of scenario right now, although not to that extent. So it's interesting to see how these cycles go back and forth. But the title of my article was The Conservative Democrat Who Time Passed By, and you kind of get the feeling that if the Democrats had stuck with more people like Bulow, they probably would have had a lot more success in the 50s and 60s than they did in South Dakota.
Let's use Bulow to segue into a question for Bill. So, as Tony was saying, if you go back through the history of politics in South Dakota, if the Democrats are successful, they likely run conservative candidates or moderate candidates like Bulow. Now, your book is really focused on radicals, I'm talking beyond your dime store liberal, radicals who are members of the Communist Party, etc. Now, those people certainly existed in South Dakota. There were some of them, but would you say this was a pretty small group of people who didn't really move the needle in South Dakota politics? Or is it your contention in the book that the radicals had a major influence on South Dakota politics?
Radicalism is a rhetorical category, but people within that don't always agree. And communists were a very small element on the left. In the 1920s, North Dakota, South Dakota, maybe eastern Montana some of the time, maybe there were 120 communists in that whole region. So we get into the 30s, and okay, there's going to be more, but the top number, I would say, for South Dakota at the very peak would have been around 300 or so. So the communists are a pretty small group on the left. Historically, the socialists were a bigger group, but my argument is that there's a much bigger grouping of people that make up the left who never thought of themselves as socialists. Sometimes it's pretty hard to refine that to specific individuals. But you have people on the left who don't think of themselves as socialists, and I think how someone thinks of themselves has a lot to do with how you identify them. They don't think of themselves as socialists, but they think the country needs a lot of big change. And they are to the left of mainstream liberalism. Now, when we're looking at South Dakota, there's some challenges to have that discussion. But there's a category not so easily put your hands on that I would say left liberal, that clearly are to the left of mainstream liberalism. Just as a happenstance, in South Dakota, in memory, you had two U.S. senators who I think were really on the left, Aberesk and McGovern, and they were both in the Senate at the same time. Now, I don't want to make a big thing out of it, but that's a divergence from the way most people would look at political history in South Dakota. Now, I wanted, when you were talking about Bureau, are you sure he was the more conservative candidate in 1942? He was running against Berry, right?
That's right.
He was a pretty conservative Democrat.
Well, he was an explicitly pro-Roosevelt Democrat, and that was the whole primary was I'm for the president and you're not.
No,
so I don't think really even conservative or not was.
I understand
Yeah.
that, but back in the 1930s, within the Democratic Party in South Dakota, you had Emil Lorek, for example, and Emil Lorek certainly had the same views as Perry.
Right.
The same party, but there was tension between them.
Well, and Bulow and Berry, and I wrote about this in the article a little, started out as friends and allies, and they're really very similar personalities. They both had this kind of cowboy Will Rogers-like persona about them. And the split really happened where Berry figured out that I need to just hug the Franklin Roosevelt, and that's what I'm going to be the biggest cheerleader for this guy in the state, and that's my path forward. And Bulow wasn't willing to do that. And I don't remember how much of this is in the article, a little of it is, but there are also some fairly long diatribes against Tom Berry, and that's the gist of it, that, really this was my guy, and we were the same on this, and he kind of went down the path, and I was too pure to ever do that. But I agree, Berry had a challenger, his own lieutenant governor, Hans Oosterud, challenged him for renomination from the left in 1934, kind of more of a Lorek's type. Berry was probably a little more opportunistic than the pure left-wing people.
Another question for Bill. You mentioned George McGovern, and he has a pretty interesting intellectual history, much more complicated than the average political person. I'm reading this new book about Truman, which is excellent, by Jeffrey Frank. He's a writer at The New Yorker. But there's a lot in the book about Henry Wallace and how nervous all the Democrats were getting about having Henry Wallace on the ticket, especially when Roosevelt was clearly getting more and more sick. And so they finally dumped him in 1944. But Wallace runs in 1948 for president as, I don't know, I'll let you characterize what he was running as. But McGovern, interestingly, when he was getting his PhD in history at Northwestern, went to the Progressive Party convention in Philadelphia in 1948. How does that fit into the world of radicalism or left liberalism that you're talking about, Henry Wallace and those early days of George McGovern?
In the 1940s, I think you have a pretty large grouping of people that you might put in the left liberal category. And Wallace certainly was one of them. That, the Democratic Party is a very interesting operation. They wouldn't let Henry Wallace run for vice president in 44. They wouldn't let Bernie Sanders run for president. And I compare that to the Republican Party that let Donald Trump run for president. There might be a lesson there. that personally, I think Wallace hasn't gotten his due. And there's a lot of, you can criticize him on all kinds of things, but Wallace was a spokesman for the left wing of the New Deal in the late 40s. And something happens in American politics between 46 and 48 that makes it virtually impossible for someone like Henry Wallace to be a viable candidate for the Democratic nomination. So he runs as an independent, or not as an independent, but as a third-party candidate. Now, no question, there's good scholarship on the Wallace campaign. No question that the Communist Party supported Henry Wallace in 48. There were a lot of other people who did support them, but a lot of them who had prominent positions didn't say it publicly. And I mentioned Glenn Talbot, who was president of Montana, of the North Dakota Farmers Union, probably the single most important state organization in the National Farmers Union in 1948. His nephew told me, when I said, how did he vote? He said, and I don't think this was on the tape, probably Wallace. Now, there were all kinds of reasons why he wouldn't have said it out loud or why he wouldn't have been identified publicly that way. Because in North Dakota that year, it was a big, big argument politically over the farmers' union co-ops. And there was a major farmers' union effort with allies to fight back these efforts against the co-ops. And they certainly didn't want to have Henry Wallace and issues on communism and so forth enter into that dispute. James Patton, who was president of the National Farmers Union, he was a real strong Wallace supporter in 45 and 46 into 47. And then he starts to really become more and more careful. When I interviewed him in 1973, there was no doubt in his mind that he wasn't for Henry Wallace to be a presidential candidate in 1948. And by 48, he wasn't interested. But along the way, up until then, he had strong ideas that were supportive of those of Henry Wallace, as did George McGovern as a World War II veteran and graduate student in history. If you want to run in electoral politics and have a chance of getting elected, and I'm up here with two political operators, you're very careful when you talk about issues of foreign policy in the Cold War years. Very, very careful. And also when you are asked about what did you do in 48? Did you go to this? Oh, yeah. Quentin Burdick, I was told by somebody, he was on fire for Wallace in 48. He went to the convention. Well, there's a book based on interviews with him that came out, 15 years ago or so. He didn't want to be publicly identified with Henry Wallace because Henry Wallace was portrayed as a fellow traveler, soft on Stalin and all that kind of stuff. There's a good book that came out on the Wallace campaign, but the author was so interested in showing how much communist involvement was there, and I don't think it fully appreciates the extent of anti-Truman doctrine sentiment in the country in 47, 48, 49. Now, by the time the Korean War breaks out and you're starting to have fighting and so forth, there's hardly anybody that wants to say out loud, I don't think we should be fighting in the Korean War, if you were identified as liberal. You could be in the North Dakota State Senate, though, and say you were opposed to the Korean War and fighting in the Korean War.
Well, let me ask one more question, then we'll open it up, see if anybody else has something to ask. And this has to do, I think it's a very interesting story, Bill, about your research and how you were able to get into the Soviet archives early on after the wall came down and do a lot of work. And I'm just curious, like, could you actually find files about the Dakotas and Montana, or how did you track down evidence about the activities of some of the people you studied out here?
In the former Soviet archive, it used to be the archive of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and also the archive of the Comintern. There's a file, a broad file, which deals with the American Communist movement. 4,300 files in that collection. I looked maybe at 10% of them. Sometimes there might be one piece of paper in there. Sometimes there might be 300 pages. When I first got a file on South Dakota, I was looking forward to it so much, and there was like some mimeograph material in that. So I was disappointed with that first file. But I went back. I was there 5 times. I worked in those files. And there's some rich material. And there's one letter from a school teacher in Roberts County, South Dakota. That's up in the northeast corner. And he wrote to Earl Browder, who was the head of the American Communist Party. And he was asking him what about religion and this stuff. And he says, we have about 50 party members in this county, and we have, I don't know how many hundred members of the United Farmers League, which was a left-wing farm group that the communists had organized. This is a letter from 1934. And he said, in my school district, he said, if people across the country felt like they did in my school district, we'd have had the revolution by now. He said, but now it looks like it's fading into the distant future. There's a school teacher in a rural school district. Now, I'm not suggesting that was representative of anything but that guy's views, but that was a letter I found in Moscow that I wouldn't be able to find here.
Wow.
Those files have all kinds of stuff written by Americans. It's all in the English language because that's how the American communists communicated with one another. Now, they run out about 1936.
Now, is
Not
there
much
any
issue.
kind of profile to these people who were members of the party in South Dakota? Like, for example, they always say the Finns, which in northern Roberts County, northern Brown County, there's a Finnish settlement there, Frederick.
Frederick area, yeah.
But is there any kind of pattern to it, or is it kind of random who joined the party?
Well, when you mention Finns, it's really a basic division among Finnish immigrants. Church Finns, we know what they're going to be, and Hall Finns, people that went to the Finnish Hall. And there's a Finnish Hall up north of Frederick, almost in North Dakota. Among the Finns, Finns and Jews probably were the 2 ethnic groups more apt to support left-wing causes than any other immigrant group. That doesn't mean all Finns or Jews were communists. They weren't, but there were some that were. And probably the largest group of communists, we might talk about 40 people or so, but the largest single unit in the Dakotas in the 1920s was Savo, Frederick, that area. Okay. But a profile, and I shy away from that term. I know that political scientists and sociologists sometimes come up with profiles. They were more likely to be rural, although there's some shopkeepers and so forth. They were more likely to have joined up in the 30s than in the 20s. And an awful lot of people didn't stay. The Communist Party, like many organizations, is sort of like a revolving door. People come in and they leave. So I'm really skeptical about a profile. The most communist in the Dakotas total might have been 600 at one time, and that might be embellished. Maybe it's 500.
All right. Well, if you want to know lots more about radicalism in the Dakotas, check out Bill's book. So let's open it up for Steve.
So, fantastic conversation. Thank you. I guess my question is, prior to World War II, which was a stronger form of radicalism in the Dakotas in the Midwest? Was it communism, or was it anti-immigration, anti-Semitism, fascism? Which was actually a stronger part of the political process in this area of the country? Because it doesn't sound like communism was particularly big.
Well, anti-communism is a very broad category. It's almost like a cloud, and there's not one strong anti-communist force. It's a sentiment that's widely held. In the 1920s and 30s, there were very few places where it was advantageous to an individual to be identified as a communist.
How about a fascist? And anti-immigration and
You know,
Yeah, that's
the 20s and 30s, there were a lot of nativist, isolationist, anti-immigrant. You know, South Dakota had a certain number of Ku Klux Klan chapters that kind of peaked in the early 20s and went away. I don't know if you'd call them fascist exactly, I suppose, the Klan, I suppose, but, you know, going back to Bulow was certainly, after World War I think there was a lot of isolationism in South Dakota in the 20s and 30s, and Bulow was very much representative of that.
And isolationism is a broad grouping as well. There are left-wing isolationists. Norman Thomas was identified with America
Right.
First.
Yeah, and that's different from anti-immigrant. I mean, Bulow's parents were German immigrants. There were, at that time in South Dakota, a lot of people were maybe not immigrants, but one generation away from that. And that probably, well, that certainly affected their view of going into World War II also, as you had a lot of people who were, including Bulow was German, a lot of people who were one or two generations from Germany and just didn't really see why we would get into the middle of a European war.
Well, in some cases, they have family members in
Right.
Germany. World War I, Hutchinson County, very little indication of left-wing sentiment down there until Wilson's second term as president. And then you have a bunch of people, once it looks like we're going to go to war, sending a petition to both the governor of South Dakota and the president demanding we get out of the war. Well, the Bureau of Investigation got down there, and you got people arrested and ending up going to prison for that. And some of them didn't speak English.
And there's an article in Volume 4 about the German language newspapers in South Dakota, which this person did a lot of those newspapers are all available, but of course you have to speak German to read them. So the cross-section of people who speak German and are interested is pretty small. But you had Germania Hall in Sioux Falls, and you know when Norbeck was governor during World War I, not a conservative by any means, but he signed the legislation that banned German language instruction in South Dakota because they were going through this kind of, and that's when a lot of these newspapers went away too, this kind of purge of the obvious German influence in day-to-day life during World War I.
In this context, we should probably mention college professor Carl Munt, who taught at Dakota State University down in Madison back then, General Beadle. He was definitely a leading isolationist. He traveled the country giving speeches to America First, et cetera, during the 1930s. And he was a major anti-communist and probably chasing around some of these guys in the 40s and 50s when he was on HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee. You know, in this whole context,
I'd mention before you get to that, the end of my chapter in this book, Bulow quotes this in his memoirs, but the guy who gives the speech kind of giving the tribute to Bulow's career in Congress was Munt. Different parties, but they were good friends and really very closely aligned ideologically. So I included that because it showed how much he had moved, and then the next chapter in the book is about Munt, so it worked out.
you know, related to all of this, I've been watching the PBS series about the Holocaust and what was going on the American side of it. Probably many people in this room have been watching it, but I've been talking to some other history people too, and trying to get a sense of how much people knew out here from the newspapers about what was happening in Germany, and how that would overcome kind of this blanket, generic desire just to stay out of European affairs. Like, we don't want to get messed up in that again because it didn't work out well the last time. So maybe I haven't finished the last episode. Maybe they get into this more, but I mean, that's kind of one of the big questions, research questions here on that topic. All right, let's take a couple more questions. Seth.
Tony, so what about Bulow made him a Democrat? Was he really a Democrat, or did we just have a Republican governor who called himself a Democrat? Did he have any Democratic views?
He was a Democrat all the way back to before he came to South Dakota. I think his parents were Democrats. You know, he doesn't really ever offer a real good, this is when the light shone and I became a Democrat. There's no real instance of that. He was involved in he was in the Senate for a term and kind of intermittently involved in state politics, but not, but at that time I think a lot of Democrats were like him. They were small government, conservative. That was the party prior to the progressive era. A lot of them were that way. He actually, I'll mention this just because you brought it up, but he got into state politics because he had a good friend who was the Democratic nominee for governor in 1924 who was trampled to death by a bull several weeks before the election. And the Democrats went to him. This is such a typical story for the South Dakota Democratic Party. The Democrats went to him and were just like, we need somebody, would you do it? And he agreed to do it, and he ran and he lost, but they all liked him and he kind of enjoyed the experience. So 2 years later they asked him if he would do it again, and he did, and it turned out that by that time the governor, Carl Gunderson, had become very unpopular, and Bulow won, and he says in his memoir that the only person more surprised by the result than Gunderson was me. I mean, neither of them saw it coming at all, but he was just kind of a folksy, he talked to the farmers and went around and just fit in with them.
I have a theory on why he was a Democrat. Probably the biggest political issue back in late 19th century, maybe possibly bigger than farm politics, was prohibition. And all these German immigrants did not like the Protestant establishment who ran the Republican Party, which was prohibitionist.
Yeah, I should have mentioned that because he does write about that too. He was very anti-prohibition.
Yeah.
Here we talk about cultural issues today, abortion and sex education in the schools and critical race theory. Hey, back in the 19th century, we had prohibition, women's suffrage, and immigration. That seemed to come up again.
Anyone else?
In looking at the
Bob.
more modern Republican Party, my late colleague Herb Cheever and I did a work, interest groups in the Midwest that was a part of the volume. And we characterized the Republican Party in this work we did in the mid-'80s as a moderate fiscal conservative party. And since that time, cultural issues have become much more pronounced within the Republican Party. I think to the point that it's maybe lost its deep roots in the meaning of fiscal conservatism and has been almost captured by the cultural issues. Do you care to comment on that?
Well, I think, like Bill said, there have always been these cultural fights, and prohibition was a bitter fight for decades, and gave rise to organized crime, and to counter that, a organized police state or police entity in South Dakota and nationally. I mean, that's why one of the reasons the FBI grew. So I think there's cultural issues are always there, but they may be a little more sharply defined now. I just read a chapter about the Republican Party in Michigan in the 50s and 60s and 70s which was kind of the pro-choice party in the state of Michigan, and the anti-abortion party were the Democrats, because they were led by all these Irish Catholic Democrats and Eastern European Catholic immigrants in Michigan. And, well, in one of these books we have a chapter about Dick Kneip, who was a German Catholic Democrat. He was a big pro-lifer. So all these things have kind of been scrambled in recent years, but I think they're pretty enduring and kind of always there. There was one more question I saw.
You mentioned the populist governor, there was Governor Lee, and I see he was, Tony, you were just writing on him. He had one of the narrowest margins of victory in South Dakota.
Yeah.
The two narrowest, yeah.
The two narrowest.
We had 2-year terms back then, and he was elected twice by
Was he
about
term
300 some votes both times.
Was he term limited from a third?
No,
No.
he
Did he try a third time?
no he we didn't have term limits in South Dakota for governor until the 40s. He ran for Congress. He was elected governor twice, in 1896 and 1898, by 300 some votes. Then in 1900 he ran for the U.S. House. Back in those days we had 2 U.S. House seats, but they were elected at large. So it worked like State House does now. You vote for 2 of the 4. And he and every other populist law. They had a couple elections where there was a Democratic Party and there was a populist party, and they ran a fusion ticket where they basically got together because that's the only way they could ever win. And so it was the fusion ticket that won in 1896, won in 1898. By 1900 they were kind of out of gas, and all their candidates, including him, lost. And then he became once the populist party, basically went away, he became a Democrat and actually ran for governor as a Democrat in, I think, 1908, and lost again.
Okay, so you touched on my question there. It was a very narrow window of time where that was a viable party with like viable candidates.
Right, and one thing that happened is once the Republicans got back into power, they made it illegal to run a fusion ticket. And so this game of 2 parties getting together and pooling behind one candidate, you couldn't really do anymore. So the structure was changed in such a way that the only way it could really work is if the populists went away and they all became Democrats. But that happened at the same time that their moment in South Dakota was just kind of gone. And then the Republicans, starting with Cole Crawford, became progressive Republicans, and I think a lot of the same factors that had motivated the populists, they kind of brought into the progressive Republican movement. Because you had a period there in the 19-teens and early 20s where the Democrats were just getting shellacked with Crawford and Peter Norbeck. And
The populist moment in South Dakota, though, is longer than it is in most places where you had populism, because they were one of the first places to actually run candidates. Is dispute whether it was Kansas or South Dakota, and they were electing a populist, even fusion ticket, but a populist governor in 1898.
And he was from the populist side of the deal. The Democrats were supporting him. Yeah.
I think we're out of time, so thank you so much, presenters.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. I'm going to finish reading it tonight.
Okay. You told me last night you were going to finish it.
I know, but I watched Thursday Night Football.
Oh, okay.
Did you say, do you not have a? They gave me several copies,
Oh,
so
well,
you can have that
well,
one if
thank
you don't
you
have